So a swimming coach once asked me about 20 years ago, I was in a workshop and it was one of those moments you could push me over with a feather. And his question was, have you got many years coaching experience or have you got 1 year of coaching experience repeated many times?
Have you got many years coaching experience or 1 year coaching experience many times? Think about that question. Reflect on it. Be honest with yourself. When I reflect back on my experience as a coach, I like to claim I got a lot of experience. I once counted coaching 36 teams in my first 10 years of coaching alone. I did a lot of coaching. But was that experience that I learned and grew from? All those hours of practice, all those games, all those camps that I ran, was I actually working on my craft? Was I getting better? The reality is not always. While I had a learning system, a very rudimentary plan, do, review process in place, it lacked intentionality and I lacked follow through on it. Without a learning system in place that we can follow through on consistently, I think we're just repeating our coaching experiences, not learning from them, like Simon Turner challenged us with that question. So in the next 3 episodes, we're speaking with 2 former guests of the podcast, Simon Turner and Alan Keane of Mvmt Sports, about their learning system for coaches: plan, do, and review. Now I'm excited because I know this system, if it's applied, it can help every one of us become better coaches, better leaders, and better people, which is what we're all about on the Coaching Culture podcast. Welcome to the podcast. If you're a new listener, my name's JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. The podcast is brought to you by TOC Culture Consulting, which I founded TOC over 5 years ago because I wanted to help coaches grow as leaders and build better cultures. If you'd like to learn more, head on over to tocculture.com. You can also subscribe to our newsletter there to get our coaching notes for this podcast. That way you don't have to take the notes, because I promise you this has got so many good nuggets, you're going to want to be reviewing them. I felt compelled to reach out to you guys here at the end of the year to talk a little bit about some of the stuff and work that you're doing in coach development, in particular around the area of kind of reflection, planning your practices, planning for games, and then, reflecting on that experience. You kind of call it the plan, do, review process. And the reason for that, guys, is because when I talk to other coaches, when I observe other coaches, I feel like there isn't a clear, very intentional process around that. And I think even I look at my own time as a coach, I might have spent 2 hours planning a practice and 5 minutes reviewing the practice, right? So I'm just kind of curious, as you guys have been building out these tools, Simon, I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the kind of common mistakes that you've kind of observed in this planning, do, review process that have kind of driven you to start to be more intentional and trying to help coaches grow in this area?
Well, first thing, it's going to sound obvious, but coaches not planning and not reviewing. I've been there myself, especially if you're maybe a volunteer parent or you're a part-time coach or you got other pressures in your program, and we can default to not planning at all. And that's kind of the first level. So in the plan, do, review process, it gets shortened to just do. And coaches in sport are just so active; they're doers by nature. You wouldn't be coaching if you weren't a doer, an action-oriented person. So just that lack of thought and intentionality and prior planning that goes into coaching is the sort of first area that we're trying to help coaches to move forward on. And then I've observed too, then the next phase being about, well, we plan and then we don't really review. And that's maybe what you were talking about a little bit, JP. And then that third level is to complete the cycle. It just seems obvious when you think about it. If learning is a cycle of doing something, reflecting on it, reviewing it, learning from it, then planning for doing the next time, if that's a cycle, then why aren't coaches completing that cycle? So we've got all these coaches running around with these open loops where they're just not completing that learning loop at all. And that's what inspires us to help coaches in that area.
Yeah, Alan, I'd be curious for you, as somebody that's obviously coached a lot of teams and has been part of the development process here for this plan, do, review. I'm guessing that's probably not where you started, when you were first out in coaching, that there was probably a lot of loops that maybe you left open just like the rest of us. And I'm just curious, as you've experimented with this and developed this, what's the value that you've seen in having an approach to planning and reviewing practice, as you guys are about to describe here?
You first of all, Nate, you're absolutely right. I definitely didn't start coaching or even 5, 6, 7 years ago. Like if I was to show you a plan, and JP, I believe you've seen a couple of my plans from a few years ago, going back 5 or 6 years, Nate, some of these practice plans were 3 or 4 pages long for a 2-hour practice with no part of a review even thought about in that really, other than probably a vent and a moan with my assistant coaches at the end of the practice about, how we didn't do stuff well or whatever it may be. And there was really no forethought to actually, what are we going to do in the next practice because of the previous practice? So to answer your question, actually, the real benefit as I've progressed as a coach in terms of how I plan my practice sessions or our practice sessions is actually doing a purposeful review at the end of it. And that pretty much tees me up or sets me up for what we should be doing in the next practice. And it does give me a chance to reflect on other things than technical, tactical. I mean, once we get into the nuts and bolts of what our plan, do, review framework looks like, it's actually reviewing more than the tech-tac execution. And I think that's a huge part, which we can unpick as we go along here in the podcast.
Simon, you mentioned this concept of loop, like this idea around a loop. And I love that term there. It makes sense when you said learning is a cycle. And I'm just kind of curious, what's the challenge of creating kind of a loop, making sure that you're completing that cycle that you see in coaching?
I think one of the big challenges is that coaches are doing that on their own, that they're not engaging their peers, they're not engaging players, they don't have anybody to coach alongside. And this speaks to the isolation that a lot of coaches feel. A lot of coaches are out there with no assistant coach, or maybe there is an assistant, but that person's more of a helper, and particularly in a youth setting or volunteer setting or school setting. It's maybe a teacher or a parent that's helping out. And that's a necessary extra adult, but not necessarily another coach. The biggest challenge is just involving other people. That's what Alan's really good at. You guys know Alan will talk about coaching till midnight, any day of the week, including Sundays, as I can attest. And it's amazing how difficult it is to complete the plan, do, review loop on your own. You can do it, but that first level of completing the loop is on your own. The second level is to involve your peers. So is there an assistant coach? Or if there's not, is there an equivalent coach in your neighboring team, a club nearby you, or maybe if you're in a school setting, a coach from a different sport? So completing that review with a peer is the next level. And then the third level, if you can get to it, is completing that review loop with the players. And that's when it gets really, really powerful. The biggest challenge is just doing it on your own is really isolating. And coaches will talk a lot too about the time it takes to complete the plan, do, review loop. I don't plan, I don't review because I don't have time. And I really empathize with that. And that's why you need tools that keep it really, really simple, which is why our model is deliberately really, really simple. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to adopt. But actually, when you think about it, if you don't have time to plan and review, then do you really have time to coach? And if you do plan and review, even in a quick way, you can really improve your experience and it might energize you. And our perception, our experience of time, therefore, changes if we feel energized by the process.
Yeah, well, before we jump into a little bit more of this plan and do review, one thing I want to comment there is even the coaches that aren't in isolation, I think the challenge for them becomes the habit, the trap of assistant coaches and head coaches of just complaining, complaining about the players, complaining about their lack of effort, their lack of engagement. It's all just focused on the players, and it just that type of mindset, I think, is very hard for coaches to break from.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, JP. I think it's worth noting, I'm sure Alan's got some examples of this, but worth noting that without completing the plan to review cycle, it's easier to complain because you're not turning the lens on yourself. As soon as you turn the lens on yourself, you might find that actually there are some things within your control that you can change, which would improve the overall experience. And maybe it's not entirely the player's fault. But if you're not even completing that loop, then you can easily get stuck in that mindset that you were describing.
Just to add to that, JP, one of the first things that if you look at the game day cards, which is a plan, do, review game day format that we call pre, during, and post game. In the pre-game plan, the first thing you actually plan for is how you're going to coach the team. Like, how should I think and act in this game is one of the first things that you write down actually after the date, after the location and who you're playing. The next thing that you fill out on that framework is actually, who do they need me to be today? So you plan your coaching. And I remember saying this to a few coaches previously, and that was it. That sounded quite alien to them. But we got to come up with the keys of the game. We got to come up with the success criteria. What's going to help us win? What KPIs are we going to track today? That's the general conversation. That's the common one. But actually starting with, how are you going to coach today based on where you're at in the season? Maybe the competition, maybe the opposition, maybe where you're traveling to. It's an away game, long trip. So you got to factor in different things. You got to consider how your players might be feeling based on a range of things that may have happened leading up to that game, or the significance of that particular game or current form. Who do they need you to be today in order for them to do well, in order for them to play effectively? So that's the first thing you do, is actually plan for your coaching. And the first thing that you review in both the practice planner and the game day card is your coaching. If you look at the practice planner, the first thing you assess is, what level was your preparation from low to high? Where was your energy level from low to high, and your communication clarity? You're grading yourself. And without getting too deep into it, where that becomes super, super effective is when you share that with an assistant coach or somebody else, or you share it with the players. Game changer, which we can probably get into a little bit later, because I think there's a lot that underpins sharing this type of things with your players and getting some genuine, effective feedback from the players. But to summarize, start with planning your coaching and start with reviewing your coaching.
One thing I like about that approach too, compared to the bitch session at the end of practice where you're just complaining about what your team can't do, is that I know oftentimes those conversations with coaches center around, why can't this athlete do this? Or why can't we, complete this pass or make this shot, or whatever it might be? And I know for me personally, over the last couple of years, that question has changed for me. And this is to your point, Alan, to how can I coach this better? Like yesterday we did a 3-on-3 scenario, where we're working on driving kick to the corner or drop off to the dunker, and we set the defense up the way we're going to see it tonight in a game. And I bet we turned it over 70% of the time when we were trying to, simulate this decision. And, again, it's easy to get frustrated with your players on that, but we're really, I think, much more deliberate now, backing up and saying, okay, we got that feedback that we're not where we want to be yet. So how do we coach it better? And starting to review, is this an individual skill problem? Is this a drill design problem? Is this a decision problem? And really looking more almost at the learning environment and our approach, as opposed to just complaining, golly, maybe next year's kids are going to be able to do this because these guys can't. And I think that's a rare conversation for a lot of coaches to have, a rare perspective.
There's a really important factor inside in what you just said, Nate, from a practical standpoint, and really, really important. If we just say the head coach, and Simon could get into this for hours on end here, so I'll touch upon this briefly, but our source of power as head coaches, very often the people around us can become somewhat compliant because we wear the head coach's badge. So I've been very mindful, and Simon's been great, hasn't it? Can you believe it, Simon? I have Simon Turner as an assistant, guys, and that's just nuts. The guy who asked the most difficult, awkward, frustrating questions is bloody assisting me game to game, practice to practice. It's amazing, but good gosh, it does come with its challenges, when you got somebody with that depth of questions. But Simon and I do this really well at the moment. And I have to give credit to one of my assistant coaches on the national team, Ian McLeod, who did it really well for the past 4 years. After every practice, after every game, we do this review process, but we don't do it together. We do it separately because with the hope that as a head coach, I'm not filtering the thoughts of an assistant coach. And I think that's a really, really important element to share, because if we were to do this review process together, maybe the assistant coach, depends on the strength of the relationships and the depth of the relationship, it might be difficult for that assistant coach to give their real thoughts to the full extent. And what I love, actually, going home on the train, guys, every Tuesday and Thursday night, I love when I get Simon's reflection first. I don't think I can filter Simon because he thinks deeper than I do. So, and it's easy for him. But maybe for previous assistant coaches I've worked with, I know it would have been difficult for them to give me their true thoughts had I given them mine first. So this is a really, really important part of the process for any head coaches listening out here, especially with a new assistant coach. Let them review so you don't filter their thoughts. And that's a real game changer.
Alan, you trigger a bigger question here, which is, how does a coach get truly objective feedback? And in many situations, I would argue it's nearly impossible because of the power dynamic in our relationships with players, particularly in any kind of education setting. It's really, really difficult to get feedback that isn't filtered through what it means for the player. So whether they are conscious or unconscious about it, a player is always asking themselves, what does this mean for me? If I give this feedback to coach, what does it mean for me? And that is happening in every single interaction that we have with our players. And then if there's an assistant coach who has less experience than the head coach, then that same process is going to be happening. What does this mean for me? What does this mean for my relationship with the coach? And 9 times out of 10, that'll be happening on an unconscious level for the players and the assistant coaches. And then there's 1 out of 10 where you get a rare situation where maybe you get somebody like me who's just kind of, I don't have a horse in the race quite as much, and I see my role as helping Alan to lead the group to the best of his ability. But you have to cultivate that, and Alan's cultivated that. He's welcomed that. He's asked for it. He's encouraged it. But it's a really difficult question. I'm not sure I've got the answer. Like, how does any coach or any leader, for that matter, get objective and useful feedback?
Well, I think you point out something there, Simon, which is so important, because I think I've come across coaches, and I've been that coach in the past, where I've been unaware that, and I've been not mindful of the fact that my assistants won't give me true feedback, and I've sheltered myself, and I think, oh, they must think everything I'm doing is great, and that the reality is it's finding ways to get them to give you that honest, objective feedback. That's important. And I love some of the stuff that you shared there, Alan, as well as, I want to dive in, with you, Simon, here, just around this plan process. Alan kind of, mentioned already the plan starts with a reflection or kind of a moment of mindfulness as a coach. You said, who do I need to be for the team today? I think that's so huge. That speaks to intentionality, as well as, I almost want to say, like, not just, who does, reflecting on the emotional state of your team and, who do they need, but kind of even taking a step back to think about, hey, where am I? Am I feeling pressure going into this game? Am I, where's my headspace? And I just think that this level of mindfulness as a coach is just huge. So, Simon, could you unpack a little bit more, maybe some of the plan tool here as far in this plan, do, review process?
Well, you raised some great questions there, JP. Asking the question, who do I want to be today, is one of the most powerful questions I think we can ask ourselves every day of our lives, let alone when we're coaching. So often our planning is based on the question, what do I have to do today? But reframing it as, who do I have to be today? It just puts a completely different lens on your planning. I would defy any person with a heart to ask themselves that question, that deeper question, and then not go into a coaching being empathetic towards the people you coach. I would defy anybody. I'm sure there's some people that could probably meet that challenge, but it's all about the questions that you ask yourself. So if you're asking about who do I have to be, then the focus on technical tactical was put into a context. It's in the context of my relationships with the players. And to the extent to which coaches plan, I would argue that most of it is around technical tactical. It's the list of drills. We've all done it, myself for decades, a list of drills and games that I'm going to play, I'm going to deliver in this practice. And the more that's on that list, the harder it gets to be flexible and empathetic to the people you're coaching. So whilst we recognize there's absolutely a place for that, and in our tools, there's an entire page for that, but then there's also prompts and stimulus around some of the other aspects of coaching. So who do I coach? How am I going to coach today? And you don't have to ask big existential questions every single time you go out to coach. But I'll give you a practical example. For a long time, I resisted having crucial and challenging conversations with players. Not because I don't want to give feedback, but because I almost became a little bit too self-aware of the process of giving feedback and wanting to get it right. And then in the process, there was a kind of messiness for quite a long time of getting it wrong, where I'm not talking about giving direction. I'm not talking about that. That's easy. But having a difficult conversation that involves giving feedback to a player in a way that empowers them and helps them to feel part or a sense of ownership over the culture of your team. So that's why in our practice plan, for example, we have space for you to write down the names of 3 people you're going to connect with and what your message and style of communication is going to be. And that has helped me no end, because those conversations I was avoiding, I'm now pre-planning. Well, that guy, JP, he got in a bit of conflict with Nate at the last session. We all know that happens. They've got a difficult relationship. It would be so much easier for me to just kick the can down the road and avoid that, or leave it to those 2 guys to sort out, rather than having a skillful conversation. If I'm going to have a skillful conversation, I've got a plan for it. And like Alan, as you know, is pretty extrovert. He's done it so often, he can kind of jump into these conversations. I'm introvert. I'm actually much more of a reflector and an observer. So I have to actually plan to talk. You might not believe that listening to me on this podcast.
And Alan, can I put you on the spot for a second here and just come back to something that you mentioned before that I think echoes what Simon's talking about here is when you've asked yourself that question, who does my team need me to be today? Can you give us an example of, on this day, my team needed me to be this. 2 weeks later, my team needed me to be this, so that we can kind of understand what were some of the ingredients that caused you to have a different approach based on what you saw with your team?
Great question. So I can give you, it's crystal clear in my head, 2 games this season. One game, we are clearly the underdog. Everybody in that gym will know it. Players definitely feel it. And I knew going into that game, they would probably feed off my level of confidence and probably feed off my level of assurance. So in that changing room, I stood there like a man who believes we're going to go out here and be the best we can be, and actually give them confidence, but assertive, because what they didn't need was a rah, rah, rah speech to spike their emotions, which are already spiked. What I needed to be was calm, but very assertive about the self-belief. So that was one particular game. So it actually channeled my delivery, my style of delivery in that pre-game team talk. And it actually helped me to plan. At the time, I was planning their player focuses. So on the game card, we have a section for player focus, and that's an individual focus for a player for that game, what would be on the front of their mind outside the team tactics. So it helped me plan that better as well. And then 2 weeks later, we played a team, I believe, in a lower division. and I had to plan to be, I had to plan higher expectations because of the potential for us to be complacent. So we played a team in a lower division. Everybody in that gym feels like we're going to win that game by double digits or maybe 30 points, let's say. And we did ended up being a 30 plus point blowout, let's say. But I knew going into that change room, I needed to be not demanding in terms of like aggressive, but clear about what I expect from the players today in terms of some of the technical, tactical delivery and what I expected from their level of focus. So that would be two different approaches based on the two different environments we were going into, knowing how the players could potentially feel.
I really appreciate the examples you just gave, because I do think they tie so well with what's, Simon was talking about in the planning process, is to, what I would say is kind of identifying the obstacles, or maybe the challenges ahead of you, and then kind of, being intentional in your case, Alan, of, how your presence should be, how you should be present with your team. And Simon, you were talking about planning out some hard conversations and how I could have engage in those hard conversations. And I think that is where I think I really tried to encourage coaches the last few years is to, hey, you can look at your practice plan and you can say, you've been coaching 10, 15, 20 years. You know where the energy is going to dip. The drill that's going to really have a high expectation and be demanding. The player he has to get 3 stops in a row before he can get out of the drill. Like, that could trigger certain individuals. So take some time to plan intervention. I just think that is huge that you're doing that, as far as in the games, and in your own practices.
Like another example, like in-game JP, it's if I look at those 2 games, being mindful of where the players are at mentally going into that game will allow you to sub better or to put the focus. So another practical example would be in the game where I'm concerned about complacency because of the level of competition, maybe I would probably sub sooner. Whereas as opposed to the other game where, maybe self-belief is a little bit lower, they're not as confident, I will allow a lot more mistakes to go because of, and planning that I feel is really important. Now, I can hear coaches on the other end going, because I would have said this a few years back, well, actually, no, you should be the same team every time. And that's not realistic. I don't feel that's reality, because at the end of the day, and I use this analogy a lot, like I don't sit at the dinner table in a restaurant the same way I sit at the dinner table at home. We're different in different environments and different things impact us. And that's just part of reality. So I think understanding that players may come to you with a different mindset in different situations is reality. But how can we plan to actually support that so that we get the best out of them, I think is the important part of the process. Simon just touched off something a moment ago, JP. I'll share if you don't mind. He talked about planning for player connections. And on the planning part of that 4-page document, there's a section for connections with players. And I'll tell you what generally happens to me with that. I plan for those connections every single practice, 3 players. And I'll tell you what generally happens. Because when I walk in the gym, I might plan to speak to you 3, but 3 other guys may come and speak to me. And before you know it, that time has gone. And now suddenly we're into the warm up and I'm going, oh gosh, I never got to do my connection with the 3 guys I planned to do because I need to speak to these guys because there's something that's hasn't been put right and I don't want to let it fester any longer. What planning for that has allowed me to do is during the session, pull out my session plan and see, oh, yeah, I need to connect with Simon tonight. I need to connect with JP over what happened last week. I can do it in a water break. Or what I actually do more often, JP and Nate, is after the practice, I deal with it there and then. If the time has been taken, if I didn't write that down, if I didn't write the plan to deal with those connections, I would have forgotten about it because of everything that would have happened that evening. And I'm getting pulled in different directions before and after the practice. Writing it down has anchored me to remembering to do it before everyone leaves that gym. So I end up doing a lot of it after the practice, actually. That's the reality.
All right, we're going to continue our conversation in the next episode of the podcast. Someone once asked me, why don't we share our entire conversation in one go, in one episode? The reason is, I don't think listening to anything for an hour, or at least anything of substance, can be truly reflected on and applied. My encouragement is for us to all take time to think about our planning process and see what we can improve. One of the good ways to do that is to review the notes this episode, so be sure to get those notes at tocculture.com. Also, check out Simon and Alan on Twitter and their website. Their details are in the episode of this podcast.